the real impact of our rapacious lifestyles and consumer choices are mostly far away and invisible to us in the West. Yet we are absolutely embedded and completely complicit in driving the climate disaster. So I'm going to sort of demonstrate that with this wonderful thing, which is a live image feed that represents the convergence of these two things, so carbon emissions and information and communication technologies. And what you see here is all the planes in the sky at any one time. I'm going to move over to, so this is all in real time, I'm just going to move over to Europe where we are. There's a lot, this is obviously data heavy, so just let it kind of load up.
I want to buy the Turin Wow.
So this is kind of a terrifying image, but it doesn't just show, it's not just showing planes. It's a map of global geopolitics. Obviously, it shows distribution of wealth and power because you can see where planes and concentrations of airports are happening or not, including conflicts. But obviously, it's a real visualization of the horrors of carbon emissions from the aviation industry in particular. Things are set to look a lot worse before we were sort of buzzing over China and Africa. So China and India. China is set to increase its airports from 230 to 450 by 2035. India likewise from 101 to somewhere between 150 to 200 by 2035. So any sort of discourse about us levelling off carbon emissions at this stage seems wildly optimistic. And the image is really powerful because it takes what is normally in our mind was impossible to quantify. It sort of shows that in a visualization that helps us comprehend. And though there are no poetics here, this is one of the roles that art can play in really helping us to kind of come to terms with things that are actually too big for the mind. So that's one of the things that we can sort of think about today. We're also looking here at big data. So this is obviously the power of real-time network technology and our dominance over space, time, and duration. You can all get this app on your phones, so you can discover it and look at it in more detail. Which brings me to my second point. Just very quickly, can you all take out your mobile phones, if you have one? Quickly now, I don't want to spend the whole, I don't want to lose time. When you've got it out, just sort of like, just hold it in the air. And leave your hands up in the air if you think that that particular device has a sort of large environmental impact.
Well, I'm going to say
good. So you're all, yeah, well, it's one of those questions, isn't it? It's often the answer. But good, you all understand that behind that phone is a significant impact. It's by far the most sophisticated, powerful, and technologically advanced device you've ever known. And pretty much everyone you know has got one. It's a device that's radically changed your behaviors, altered the way you think, concentrate, and interact with others, creating neural pathways that make you grab for it at every opportunity. And that's the peaks in dopamine as well as the stress hormone cortisol. And not to mention the electromagnetic fields from the phone itself that sort of activate and excite the brain cortex. So, and into that device, of course, has bundled many other material objects into itself. So the Walkman, the iPod, the map, the torch, the ruler, the wristwatch, the telephone, the notepad, the dictaphone, the compass, the GPS, the games console, the radio alarm, the diary, the mail delivery, the newspaper, the camera, the video camera, the wallet, the ticket, the thermometer, the boarding pass, the credit card, the book, the timetable, the fitness coach, and all the other things that these technologies have enabled that weren't familiar to us sort of before, including the smartphone itself. The unintentional genius of these additional functions means that you keep grabbing, every time you grab for that phone, you're triggering and reinforcing the need for constant neural connection. So in relation to those kind of airplanes, what if I told you that the sum total of your mobile phone and the Internet of Things and the network of those technologies was equivalent to the entire aviation industry in terms of CO2 emissions? And that is an industry that has been created in basically less than a decade. In less than a decade, we have doubled the potential threat and CO2 emissions from those technologies. What this shows on the left here is, sorry, up there, the mobile unique subscribers. That's individuals who've taken basically out a mobile phone contract, and the 9 billion, approaching 9 billion there, is basically SIM-to-SIM connections. So that would include businesses. That's the sum total of mobile connections. So that's kind of, that's a troubling statistic, that that equals that of the climate, the aviation emissions. And that's without taking into account the creation of the hardware that makes that industry possible, including the slave labour and hazardous conditions of both the mining of precious metals and minerals at one end, and the waste dumps and the highly toxic materials that get thrown away at the other. So what we're talking about here is extractive capitalism and free markets for raw materials that have destroyed the mechanisms of protection and sovereignty throughout the developing world, including indigenous land rights, water rights and human rights. And exporting our most polluting industries to other parts of the planet is part of our attempts to meet reduced emissions and environmental sustainability targets. So when in the UK, and we're doing really well, apparently we're going towards our targets, you have to bear in mind that's because we're offloading most of our pollution elsewhere. And that's really a kind of smoke and mirrors of environmental solutions cooked up not by scientists and engineers, but by accountants and economists. And that's why people like the late Polly Higgins, who fought to make ecocide a crime against humanity, it's so important. Policies and laws that will protect those people from toxic pollution and environmental harm, as well as holding those industries to account. So within the next 2 years, the mobile phone industries are growing with the introduction of 5G, which is a kind of thing that will enable a kind of new smart or intelligent connectivity, smart machines talking to smart machines that provide individuals with a kind of smart freedom, as the story goes. That smart freedom in which we can be free from the burden of thinking at all. With a colossal increase in data traffic everywhere comes the need for energy, water and ever more carbon emissions. The 2015 atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide passed 400 parts per million. The fourth industrial revolution, essentially partly what I've recently just described, takes us further and quicker than we might have hoped in terms of those emissions and energy consumption. At the current growth rates, we would pass 1,000 parts per million by the end of the century, and at 1,000 parts per million, human cognitive ability drops by 21%. So your thinking capability starts to drop as too much CO2 comes into the air. These levels and higher have been recorded in classrooms in heavily industrialized parts of the world already. So just to illustrate that, I want to take a quote from the artist James Bridle and his book, The New Dark Age. Carbon dioxide clouds the mind. It directly degrades our ability to think clearly, and we are all walling it in the places of education and pumping it into the atmosphere. The crisis of global warming is a crisis of the mind, a crisis of thought, a crisis of our ability to think another way to be. Soon we'll not be able to think at all. So given that in the digital world we are already trading contemplation and reflection for constant neural connection and instant stimulation, how then can we forge a new political subjectivity that is our own making, that it isn't driven by the kind of flights and fancy and the dream worlds of Silicon Valley? There's an argument that says without an embodied experience, say participating in civil disobedience or something else, without an embodied experience, a critical conscience like a fleeting epiphany cannot develop into a durable political awakening that actually enables us to transform the patterns of our behaviour. Theatre director Augusto Boal and Brecht before him believed that one needed to seek another kind of poetics, and that this should be based on the principle of trespass, as in the invasion of the scene in which the spectator appropriates the power of the actor. So that we don't just liberate our critical conscience, but our bodies too. Therefore, it's through active participation, as we're going to see in many cases today, that when we become actors in the struggles against climate disaster, when our bodies become essential to the dynamics of resistance, only then can we hope to truly awaken that kind of critical conscience. And at the same time, flexing this disobedient muscle we didn't know we had. So in that sort of, through participation, we develop that sort of, we find and we develop that muscle. So I hope that today will give us some inspiration to help us think more critically, because really the environmental and ecological crisis certainly is a crisis of the mind. So hold the mobile phone in your imagination as, and all the world that's created around that as a major thing we need to kind of think about and address as we continue to consume all the wonderful things that universe provides us.